Welcome back, everyone, to our next keynote talk of the day. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Dirk Bergemann to be our next speaker. Dirk is a professor of economics at Yale University. He has secondary appointments in computer science and finance. His research is in many areas, including game theory, contract theory, market design, more recently work in information design and data markets. Dr. Bergemann is a towering figure in economics and economic theory. He's built new research agendas in robust mechanism design, now in information design, and he is a very big source of inspiration for me and many other theorists in this area. So I'm so glad he can join us today in our launching of this conference and for the dialogue earlier today with Dr. Gray on data control and data markets. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bergemann to speak about data, social data, and data governance.
Great, thank you, Irene, and I'm very happy to join this first opening conference of this new group at EAAMO on equity and access and algorithm. I think it's a great initiative, and so I'm very happy to be part of it. What I wanted to do today is to talk and use you both in some ongoing research that I've been conducting with my colleagues on the value and the economics of data, in particular of social data. And then for this talk, draw some implications from that for the way we should govern data, how we should propose data governance as a public policy tool, and give you a little bit of an impression of where the current discussion on governance stands and how it relates to the academic and scientific insights and work that has been ongoing. Okay. Let me see what the great. So let's start out with data and data collection. As we are all too familiar, the rise of large internet platforms really led to an unprecedented collection of individual user data. We are all aware of Amazon and Facebook, Google in the US or in the West largely, but similar entities in Asia and China, in particular JD, Tencent, Alibaba, and in some sense even further ahead than what we experience in the US. These platforms, through a steadily increasing user base, generates really massive amounts of data about individual consumers. I apologize, I'm an economist, so I often think about individuals as consumers, but let's just talk about them as individuals. So we learn, or the platforms learn about their preference, locations, friends, political views, and of course, it's not just sort of adult individuals, but it's teenage individuals, as we just hear in the recent discussions surrounding Facebook. And to a large extent, this individual data allows companies to refine their products, to offer search results, offer personalized product recommendation, informative ratings, timely traffic data, all things that we quite enjoy and value. But at the core of these data collections from individuals is really the central aspect that I'm going to argue for today is its social dimension. Namely, when we capture, or when the digital platform captures data from an individual users, then not only does it tell us about something about this individual user, but it really is informative about all users similar to them. And thus, from the very beginning, we are facing a problem of how to deal with the social data. And it's precisely the social dimension of the data that is driving the value of the digital service. Okay? So think about shopping data as an example. An individual's purchase conveys information to a third party, say Amazon, about the willingness to pay for a given product, the demand level for a given product, essentially among all consumers with very similar purchase history or other observable and unobservable characteristic. And it's precisely the social nature of data that generates a significant, I would say, massive informational externality across the consumers, or sometimes referred to as a data externality. And today I want to suggest some of the main implications that follow from the presence of the data externality in the middle of the data economy. The social dimension of the data simultaneously leads to a loss of privacy, because I don't need to say too much to Facebook or to Google or to Amazon about myself for them to actually know quite a bit about me simply from people who are like me, okay? And while there's a loss of privacy, there's also gain information. Clearly the prediction, say the search results that I'm going to get, are going to be informed by similar searches that people like me performed, okay? And what is new and what makes it so challenging is that if you think about this in externality, just in the regular economics term, the sign and the magnitude of this data externality, namely whether individual users experiences as a positive externality or as a negative externality, depends very much on the structure of the data. That is, what is sort of the network, the underlying network that we're trying to characterize, and also on the downstream use of this information. That is it used to basically create socially valuable matches, or maybe is it used to offer price discrimination and therefore just extract surplus from the consumers. Okay. Independent of the sign, the presence of this data externality suggests that in the data economy, we are likely to often have inefficient market outcomes, okay, because the externality simply will lead to socially inefficient allocation. And when we are concerned about the social aspect or the data externality, we should be aware that in fact, this externality may operate multiple times, or if you wish, at an extensive scale, because of course, the data is not just used for a single prediction, but is also used to inform all the algorithms that are being run. So really, the externality may operate multiple times at an extensive scale. For this audience that is of interdisciplinary character and comes from everywhere, let me suggest another externality, just to draw sort of a little bit of an analogy, and also to point out to the distinctions. Think about the most classic environmental externality, carbon emissions, okay? The sign of the externality that we suffer from a carbon emission by a producer is almost universal and clearly can be signed to be negative, okay? So that makes it easy for policy to think about what are the right tools and prescription to limit the externality. It doesn't make it easy necessarily to implement it, but regulatory restrictions could mean that we want to restrict the capacity. We want to restrict the number of carbon emitting factories or carbon emitting energy producers. There might be economic restrictions or economic tools that we can use, such as a carbon tax, to increase the private cost of generating and bring it closer to the true social costs of the use of carbon emissions. Okay. This is much more difficult in the world of the data economy because a priori we know neither the sign nor do we know the level in some sense of the externality. Okay. So what's the structure that I want to think about it? So it often helps to think about a concrete example, right? So if you think about users of search engine, think about users of social networks, the structure is essentially the same. There are consumers who are providing information to a data intermediary. Sometimes that information or the generation of information, the production of information is supported by payments or by services. But then a data intermediary is basically bundling all of this information and further selling it, say in a sponsored search auction or a digital advertising auction, to a producer who's using this information to tailor product, but also price between his product and the consumer. So there's going to be some surplus that is either reduced or increased through the use of the information. And that's the situation that I think we want to think about it. Now, easy examples here are, think about search. Okay, there clearly consumers are generating the search terms. Okay, they are compensated. We want to ask, is this the right level of compensation, perhaps by a service, and then it's monetized on the other side by the intermediary, here Google, by auctions that basically elicit a part of the surplus that the advertisers are willing to pay. This picture, this depiction, this diagram can of course look much more elaborate. So if you think sort of an entire supply chain of data, going from consumers upwards to the apps. So that's the upstream market, the data market, that's being monetized by Facebook, and then being brought down to the firms that again are now permitted and allowed and have the ability to tailor their offerings to the consumers. Okay, these are all instances of where the data economy is interacting with the downstream economy, so that the real economy is where we are going to then exchange product and services. Okay. Three central questions that I think are relevant to get a grasp on how the data economy works is to say, how does the social dimension of data impact the terms of trade between consumers, data buyers, and the large digital platforms which for the moment enable that? Okay. What's the sense in which the social dimension of the data magnifies the value of the individual data and perhaps lowers the cost of data acquisition? Some colleagues at MIT, Daruna Samoglu and Arthur Ostergler, have related work that says too much data in the title, which basically says there's a sense in which the cost of acquiring the data is too low. And what I'm going to argue today is that that low cost is basically explained through the data externality. Okay. How does this relate if you now want to think not just about the data, but we want to think about the data governance to some fundamental flaws that we want to think about? Well, first of all, currently property rights for data are weakly defined, if at all. The value of data is rarely publicly disclosed. Okay, so think about how much we know about the price for matching advertisers and users as being realized through digital advertising auctions. Okay, this data is essentially unavailable, and it's only being realized at the digital platforms to whom it's proprietary data. This lack of pricing data is similar and similarly evasive in the entire world of health economics, where we find that there's huge inefficiency because consumers basically don't get any signals about the right decisions due to the lack of pricing data. Okay. Moreover, the lack of disclosure of any of this data that is emerging through these transactions in the ad tech stack, if it's sometimes called, would be very notable in other industries. So think about financial service industry, where fees by regulation need to be disclosed that brokers charge their clients. That is not at all the case in our current data economy. Okay. The lack of public price data also renders it very difficult for new companies or new institutions to emerge and to address data externality. On a very basic level, we don't even have good measurements of market power and market indices that would say how much data concentration is there. That is, can we make an argument for there being perhaps too much of a monopolistic strategy, because we don't know how much of the data flows, say through Facebook, say through Google. And so a very elementary insights and information that we need for public policies is currently simply not available. And so that limits, of course, our ability to guarantee access and fairness to data and the use of the data. Okay. Let me give you just one picture of that from a paper. I'm going to come to the references at the end, that's entitled "The Economics of Social Data," that's just about to be published. What I want to take here is simply a two-dimensional pictures with basically on the right-hand side, is on the x-axis, plots the correlation and the underlying preferences. Okay, so that's the preferences, and on the y-axis is giving you the correlation across users or individuals in terms of the noise or the experience that they're suffering. What we show in this paper is that what will be profitable data intermediation, which is the entire area in this two-dimensional diagram, is in green, fails to, in a reasonable sense, match which when there should be socially efficient data intermediation, which is all of the area to the red. Okay, which is to say, if you think about the lower left corner, there is often too much data acquisition. So there's being too much data acquired at too low a cost by the digital platform. That is when situations are such that we learn too much from one individual about the others. That is when the data externality operates such that it lowers the cost of data acquisition. Okay. If you think now on the northwest corner, where data intermediation is socially beneficial but doesn't happen in a marketplace, that's an area when we basically fail to trade on data. And that is when the aggregate data would allow us to essentially denoise the data and give individuals better predictions about their right choices and their right actions. So an example where I think this is descriptive is the health market, where, for example, or the health environment in general, where during the time of COVID, we clearly realized that we didn't fully realize the benefits that could come from data intermediation in terms of alerting us to virus transmission, to all kinds of public health data that we should have generated, but the market certainly failed to generate that. Okay, and the public instruments were probably too weak. So this is to suggest that in the presence of the data externality, we can't expect the market necessarily to establish efficient outcomes and therefore socially efficient outcomes. And therefore, we want to think a little bit about the data governance that we're proposing for data and for social data. Okay. Let me sort of pause here for a second and relate it now to the current level of policy discourse. Right? Earlier in the morning, when we had the discussion with Mary, we already observed a surprising lack in public rules that govern the creation, exchange, and usage of private or individual data. Okay? To some extent, it's our for the scientists, as economists, I can speak for them, but perhaps also for computer scientists, of not really pushing the dialogue and pushing the discourse further enough. But I think that has changed over the last few years, and it's a particular concern for civil society, for democracy, for underprivileged or for minorities that pushed us to think a little bit more about it, or think about addictive issues about in the use of social media as it came just about. Okay, and so this is a well-timed discussion because there's both on the regulatory side, that is from the Justice Department, from the FTC, a large number of cases that basically tries to evaluate what the current position of the digital platform is. And then there's also, from the legislative point of view, quite a bit of action currently proposed in the US House that would give us, for the first time, a governance framework to think about the data economy. Okay. Let me perhaps, in view of the data externality, discuss 3 possible data governance solutions that would be following logically from the data externality. Okay. The loss of privacy is something that is of concern, and so one first, in some sense, layer to preserve privacy is to think about guaranteeing as a default a purely contextual regime to be operating at a lot of digital platforms or digital interaction. Okay, so just as you enter a store today and the prior assumption is there's no information collected about you, nor is the data collected about you, nor do you need to identify yourself. So should we basically insist that we can interact with the services of a company without any further identification or data collection. Okay, this clearly would elevate, in some sense, the bargaining position of the individual consumers vis-a-vis large digital platforms. In the presence of an externality, the typical answer of an economist is to think about internalizing the externality. How can we make it such that we are going to be able to internalize the externality so that it essentially disappears as a friction, as an impediment for socially efficient allocations. Okay. Finally, the loss of privacy has brought out a number of superb small computer-inspired solution of preserving privacy by not shipping the data to the cloud or to a central platform, but rather to bring the algorithm to the data. So federated learning of cohorts, in situ rights that can be granted are also solutions that perhaps I just wanted to highlight. Good. Another one, let's go back to the environmental externality, could of course be just the standard taxation that simply raises the costs for data collection by the digital platform. And so that's one issue or one instrument that we should at least keep in mind. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about the contextual regime, right? We are basically used now that every interaction with the website immediately generates a lot of data and is being collected. A governance regime could simply say, as a default, every service has to be offered at a purely contextual level where no or minimal data collection arises. Okay, such uniform service without any segmentation across users and across their observable and unobservable characteristics would of course imply a much higher level of fairness in the allocation or equality in the allocation. Okay, and it would implicitly assert property rights to the individual data, namely, it is only after deliberation whether I want to enter into a different exchange level in some sense, that is data for service, that I'm granting the rights to access the data. Okay. This is quite different from what current policy suggestions, in particular the GDPR rules in Europe, which implicitly actually offers a choice of consumers between declining access to data but then having no service at all, or receive the service but then have immediately a loss of data property rights. So how we are choosing the default level, how we're choosing the outside option for the consumers really matters in terms of the property rights that we set. Okay. Internalizing the externality by creating a firm, a community, a cooperative, so it can be a profit or it can be non-profit entity, we might be able to basically collect individuals and have them represented by a much larger, if you wish, by a collective bargaining unit that helps internalizing the externality and redress some of the balance in the market. Okay? How realistic is that? Well, if you think about this, really collective bargaining already exists in this guise, okay? Apple receives large transfer payment for Google to place search engine on an iOS devices, but really what at that point Apple is bargaining on behalf of, but not necessarily for, are the consumers and users that are collected on the iOS devices. Likewise, Google provides software at below cost to the margins, to the device makers, in exchange of data collection rights that are going to follow from them. Okay? That just shows you how powerful this idea of internalizing externalities, but of course, in the moment, it's done by the digital platform largely on behalf of themselves rather than on behalf of the consumers that they represent. Okay. So that leads us to think about, should there be not something like a data fiduciary? Okay. And a famous article, my colleague and law professor Jack Balkin at Yale asked the question, doctors and lawyers are prohibited from using clients' information for their own interests, so why aren't Google and Facebook? Okay, so they suggested that any intermediary that has as one of its purposes to collect the information should follow and should be subject to data fiduciary duties like doctors and lawyers and even brokers are in other contexts. And so this is in fact something that's proposed in the current proposal that is in front of the New York legislation, and that goes much further than the California Consumer Privacy Act. Okay? This is just to show that these discussions are underway and that they are really meant to address this fundamental externality that we have identified earlier on in the talk. Okay. And here's, of course, where a lot of ingenuity and engineering intelligence is required, and which is sort of a great open problem, I think, for computer scientists to work on, because what's the notion of information fiduciary? How can we make this work? How can we, guarantee security and control over personal data? And in fact, there are a number, perhaps Solid by Tim Berners-Lee, who is sort of developing a platform to link data applications that offer full control of personal data, is one of them. Digime is another private sharing app. So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting development and relevant scientific thought about how we basically can rebalance and eliminate the externality that in the moment really hampers the digital economy. Okay, and I think with this, my time is over. Economists know that there are limits to collective bargaining that is relevant, and so there are clearly challenges in bringing intermediaries into this market, but the gains are quite large, and so I think we should think about it. I mentioned that the other notions that basically restore some of the privacy, some of them perhaps more self-serving than others, but it's definitely an area in which computer scientists, economists, and data scientists have lots to talk to each other and have lots to say to each other, and can help improve public policy outcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dirk, for that really fascinating and thought-provoking talk. I really enjoyed this discussion of what can markets do and where do we need regulation, and some of the examples you provided. We're running a little bit over time, and so I think we won't have time for Q&A. So what I'm going to do is, Dirk, there's a question for you from Mary Gray in the Q&A. If you want to type the answer to that question, I think it's a fantastic question, so just reading it out for the rest of our audience. How does the analysis that Dirk provided change if the data tells us not only about users similar to us, but also about social relationships amongst groups of users? So Dirk, I'll let you type the answer in the Q&A there.
Yes, so it's a brilliant question, and it's actually a very challenging question, because in some sense, as soon as I establish a social relationship, there's a sense of similarity, right? And so then the question, who owns this? That is, if I would like to say I want to move my data from Facebook to somebody else, do I have the rights to move not just my own data, but also my links to other people? I think these are very deep conceptual issues for network scientists, for computer scientists, for economists. So I think I would think of them as very related, and by definition, I think I would want to think about as relationship as being establishing similarity, connectedness, and that's sort of the key notion. I think that is very important.